I am delighted to introduce John Markoff and Greg Zachary. And on the way out, Amy said to Greg, because of your jacket, you may not need a mic. So if you'll both walk out, there you are.
Well, thank you very much for coming first thing in the morning. I'm really delighted to meet with you and be in Portland again. And also, my dear friend John Markoff, who's the author of a new book released this week, Machines of Loving Grace, and importantly, The Quest for Common Ground in the subtitle. We're going to talk today somewhat about how human values can persist in an age increasingly of smarter machines. So, John began his reporting career covering the hobbyist era of personal computing. This is back in the 1970s, I bet before some of you were born. And the first computers, personal computers, were kits. People assembled them. And that's where Steve Jobs and Wozniak started, and Bill Gates as well. He was early to recognize the vast power of the internet and the first journalist in the world to write about the World Wide Web. And for many years, John was synonymous with writing about the internet and its increasing role in society. He was also the first to report in a sustained way about computer crime. And he wrote a series of stories on the greatest hacking scandal of the 20th century when a child, a son of a high-ranking NSA official, National Security Agency, broke the myth that computers were secure. And Markoff was so plugged in that he even caught or identified Robert Tappan Morris before the police did. And that's how John happened to be present when the police arrested Morris. He coined the term digerati to describe Silicon Valley technical culture. He was the first journalist to recognize that cybercrime could morph into cyber war, and even recently influenced U.S. policy to step up involvement in cyber war. He recently, much against my avuncular advice, met with all the leading officials of the national security state in Aspen, Colorado. And embarrassingly, he had the chance to strangle some of them, but did not. Which is why he's here today. I must admit he wouldn't have been able to attend otherwise. So he's playing a long game. He's got a clear understanding of computers and software, what they do, how they do it. He was also the first journalist to ride in the Google driverless car and immediately recognized that that car drives better than he does. He's really, I am a very arrogant person. I'm narcissistic. I'm self-absorbed. This is a rare person that breaks me out of that. I'm in awe of this guy. I call him a living legend, not an exaggeration. He's done a tremendous amount to enhance public understanding of digital technology, which has been so often muddied and obscured by hype and the profits to be gained from it. We've had the privilege to teach classes together at Stanford and UC Berkeley. He has a vast knowledge of people. I always feel improved when I converse with him, and I think you will be improved as well. If you don't get enough from our short encounter, and I think you'll have an appetite for more, please look at his book, Machines of Loving Grace, and also some of his earlier works are well worth reading as well. So, John, happy that you've been here.
Thank you, Greg, for that introduction. You know, the one thing you forgot
I did forget something.
Is that I'm a duck. And
oh, I am so sorry. He's right. He means an Oregon duck. I forgot. He's an alumnus of University of Oregon. Yeah, no, very, very true. That's very, very true. And it's a reminder of how much Oregon has changed, because this place called Eugene used to be the coolest place in Oregon before most of you were born. And that's why John was up there in the late 70s. You know, you once told me, John, that secretly you think of your name as John Markoff of the New York Times.
I can tell you that.
You've worked as a reporter and writer and editor there for decades, yet at the same time you've carved out a persona as a book writer. How has the Times helped you, and how has it hurt you? How has it limited you?
Well, you know, I said that in the context of, you know, I grew up and you grew up sort of reading what was called New Journalism at the time, Tom Wolfe, and that was when journalism was about identity as much as it was about the reporting. It was about the Hunter Thompsons and the Tom Wolfes of the world, and which I loved reading, but I just decided that that wasn't the direction I wanted to go in. I was more interested in reporting. You know, Greg said that I grew up with the people who created the personal computer industry, and what was fun about that is it didn't start out as an industry. It was a hobbyist movement, and I was around at the time that you know, the hobbyists were running the show, and out of that came the Gateses and the Jobs. And being at the Times, I mean, we were both outsiders as journalists before we were insiders. We were competitors in the 1980s and 1990s. Greg was at the Wall Street Journal, and I was at the Times covering Silicon Valley, but we didn't start out that way. I started out at a little alternative news service, and he did the same thing. And you know, I always wanted to know when I was on the outside what it was like to be on the inside. And it turns out that it helps you in some ways. I mean, you have access, and of course you pay a price for access. So that was, I still, you know, you take advantage of what you've got in terms of resources.
No, well put. And you know, partly I'm here to embarrass John with personal details that I only know. And one of them is John's father, a beloved man, was a member of the Communist Party in the 1950s, and John has a sort of red diaper baby background. And it turns out that he grows up in Palo Alto, and he's a follower of the Grateful Dead. They're a teeny bit older than you, I think, the band, a few years. So what got you interested in computers? You're in this environment of Joan Baez and the Grateful Dead and a bunch of communists, some of whom are your parents.
Yeah, so we
How did you bust out of that?
We both came out of this culture of being political activists. We grew up during the anti-war period. And at a certain point, I can't speak for Greg, but I woke up and discovered that the movement was over and that I sort of hadn't gotten the memo. And at the same time, I sort of changed, my politics changed. You grow up and, you know, what changed about my politics is I became unclear about what the answer was. I had no problem describing the problem, but the answer became opaque, and I decided that being a reporter was a great way to sort of contribute to society, basically, by sort of unmasking things that needed to be unmasked.
And to some extent, objectivity allowed you to hide your background.
Well, no, I mean, objectivity is very hard, but so, you know, when I was around for the when I came back to the Bay Area after I left Oregon in the mid-1970s, there was this industry growing up, and at the same time, Silicon Valley at that point was based on a defense industry. So there was what I thought of as the, you know, dark side of the force and the light side of the force. And I started by writing about the military technology industry, and it very quickly became apparent to me it was more fun to write about these guys who were developing computers and using them as fantasy amplifiers. They didn't know even what they wanted to do with them. They just knew that they wanted their own computer.
And then a paradox emerges that the computer revolutionaries start to realize that there's other revolutions that computers can promote. And when did you realize that the computing revolution was linked to other transformative agendas that progressives had embraced for 100 years?
So a lot was going on, but there was one book, actually. So the microprocessor had just shown up on the scene in the mid-1970s, and nobody really completely understood the kind of impact that the microprocessor was going to have on society. There was a book written by a British journalist called The Micromillennium, and I read that book and I realized that the microprocessor was going to have this huge impact pretty early, and I thought, well, I'll pursue that. And I began to write about sort of the social, political, economic impact of the technology. And I sort of got drafted into, I mean, we were outsiders. I joined the staff of the first weekly personal computer newspaper in 1981. And that sort of gave me this ringside seat to cover the growth of this industry.
Yeah, and that was called InfoWorld. Now, as you got into the inside, and I'm going to accuse you of something now which is clearly unfair, but you're asking us to believe that robots can be our partners. Are you really kind of presenting a Trojan horse? Are you kind of helping the rich and powerful by basically arguing that, yes, we can manage this transition. We can make robots our friends, so get close to them. And just as we follow John's advice and we get close to robots and they become intimate partners, then they crush us. Then they do something really terrible and crush us. And so, then I realized that, yes, you really are against us. Are you?
Well, you have to remember, I'm not designing the robots. But there is something significant going on right now in terms of robotics that sort of speaks to what Greg's raising. And that is that, you know, until now, robots have largely been in cages. I mean, so I have a broad definition of robots. It includes machines that are embodied, machines that are arms, machines that are actually cars. But I also believe the things that we're beginning to interact with that are disembodied, things like Siri and Cortana and Google Now, those are also robots. And what's new, I mean, sort of the two things that are new in terms of what's going on now, robots until now have largely transformed the sort of the industrial and the machine side of things, and now they're starting to do cognitive things. So for the first time, we have machines that they're not intelligent in the sense that humans are intelligent, but we treat them as if they're intelligent. This is more sociological in the sense that it is technological, because we as a species have a sort of propensity to anthropomorphize almost anything we interact with, whether it's our dog or our robot. And as these robots increasingly appear to be intelligent, we interact with them as if they're intelligent. So that's one thing, that the machines are becoming more intelligent and they're beginning to act in human-like ways. The other thing that's happening is they're beginning to move around in the environment. Until now, machines have largely been confined to cages, and they're coming out of the cages for the first time.
So are Musk and Stephen Hawking correct that we should be seriously worrying about them attacking us? Is their dark vision correct?
Well, so I don't believe that machines are going to become self-aware in the sense that humans are self-aware in our lifetime. That's a guess. However, I think even if they're not self-aware in a human sense or a biological sense, they are going to be increasingly autonomous. And so I think there are things that we should think about as a society, and that's where we get back to what's the relationship these machines have to you and me. And, you know, in the reporting of this book, a guy by the name of Alan Kay, who actually was the guy who invented the modern personal computer, sort of said what I thought was the most profound thing about our relations to these machines. So even though there's this sense that these machines have a life of their own, they're really just tools. I mean, they're designed by humans, and they are imbued with code that gives them properties, whatever they are. And so my argument is we have a choice. We can design these machines as slaves, or we can design them as partners, or they can become our masters. And
that's a very good point.
That's a human decision in my mind.
Okay, before we go, I want to go to show us some of the robots John's met. But were any of the robot designers, if they are human creations, were any of the robot designers you met in your book Black Americans? Were any of them Puerto Ricans? Were any of them even women? Was there a single designer that was a woman?
Yes, they're women. I'm trying to think if they're blacks or Puerto Ricans. No, it's a pretty insular, pretty male community that's designing machines, so of course it would have a certain set of values.
So is that a concern maybe to try to break that down?
I think it's a tremendous concern. I mean, this is something that sort of besets Silicon Valley right now, and so I don't think Silicon Valley has a good answer to that problem, but you're right.
Let's look at some of the robots that John encountered. That's a good one.
So,
Well, we're going to see. We're going to see.
can we talk a little bit about this one before we see the next one?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
So this was just a couple months ago, and in terms of the fear about the Terminator, and how quickly these machines are going to. So this was a DARPA contest that followed on the Autonomous Vehicle Grand Challenge, and this was basically 25 of the best robotics team in the world spending a year and a half trying to build a machine that could do things that we do without thinking. And so this is really ground truth. This is where we are when you spend multiple millions of dollars. And to the Terminator question, Rod Brooks, who's a pioneering roboticist who came and watched this after he saw this, said, because almost none of the robots could get through the door, he said, if you're worried about the Terminator, keep your door closed.
Well, let's look at the other one. Let's look at the other one, which is more worrisome. Well, this is
a Google robot.
This is a Google robot. This is scarier.
Well, no. Think about this as a delivery man bringing the package to your porch.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that benign interpretation. So we've had enough of that one. The robots and war as a scenario, you address well in your book, but you do avoid a subject. You tell us everything in your book there is to know about R&D with robots, but there's nothing about sex and robots. Yeah, you avoid entirely the subject of how robots can assist in our achieving sexual satisfaction. I want to know why is
that's
that,
actually
John?
not. No, you missed there. That's not true,
Oh,
Greg.
it's
There
not
is
true.
So, if you've seen the movie Her, which a relatively lonely guy falls in love with a
Relatively lonely in your view. Huh?
Yeah.
I'd say very lonely, intensely lonely.
So one of the stories that I tell in the book is about a woman who set up a company to build these things called FAQ bots. And these are simply programs that you interact with by text, and they attempt to parse natural language, and they speak back to you. What she did was she had a product in an Australian company, and she put an FAQ bot on the website of one of the largest banks in Australia. And 90% of the people who were interacting with that FAQ bot thought that there was a human on the other side. So what I'm trying to say is the bar is pretty low. But then what she did was, because she wanted some publicity, she created 2 demonstration programs. One was called My Perfect Boyfriend, and the other was called My Perfect Girlfriend. And there was a lot of traffic to My Perfect Girlfriend.
But that's because it was Australia, I think.
But wait.
I think it was because Australians were involved.
No, this was in the U.S. She'd moved to the U.S. by this time. The company was and so what she did is she put up a paywall in front of My Perfect Girlfriend. And 4% of the traffic continued. And then she read the transcripts, and she discovered that she'd become, in effect, a digital madam. And it freaked her out so much that she shut it down. And then IBM bought her company, and they're using that technology.
And they started it up again. Yeah, no, that's a good happy story.
They're using that technology, but it's an issue. I don't have any deep understanding of the psychology that's behind that, but it's been true since ELIZA in the 1960s Weizenbaum created an interactive program.
Well, I'm going to ask John one last question before we open it up. So if commercial sex workers are threatened by robots, if their livelihoods could be undermined by the advent of these new forms of robotics, what other workers will be affected? And then how will the job system absorb this big hit?
That's a huge question. Let me just say that I came into that with very much that perspective, like, oh my God, this technology is evolving very quickly. We're in deep trouble. And in the last 2 years, I've really adjusted my perspective, and I have a very different sort of point of view than the hand-wringing view. And part of it came out of sort of exploring what was going on in China, where most of manufacturing is going on right now, and sort of going to Danny Kahneman, this economist, and saying, there's going to be social chaos when they deploy robots. And Kahneman said to me, you don't get it. The robots are going to show up in China just in time. And I said, what? What do you mean? His point is we take these snapshots and we look at things, but if you look at China, it is a rapidly aging society, as is Japan, as is Korea, as is Europe. And in fact, he may be right. The robots may arrive just in time. I could go on for hours about this. It's a very nuanced situation.
Yeah, it's a complex situation. Yeah. But the point John's making, I think that's really important, is the developing world of low-wage workers, which has done so much to deindustrialize the U.S. and reduce our manufacturing, they may be the first parts of the world hit by the industrial robotics. They may face the unemployment much more than our society. So we want to get some questions. It's a little dark out there, but if you emerge, yeah.
So
Oh, there's somebody else. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. You'll be second.
John, I can feel either Greg or John can feel this question, maybe both of you. I'd like to ask you a philosophical question. Haven't read the book yet, looking forward to it, but you might discuss this in the book. My question is, what does it mean to be human?
What does it mean to be human?
This is a great question. It's a great question because one thing it means to be human is to be diverse and contradictory. And so in our approach, if we take a human-centered approach to robots, what does that mean since we humans disagree about so much?
Well, and I also think humanity, what is human, is actually situated in the interaction that we have. I mean, being human is not to be isolated, but to be in a community, in a society. That's what it is to be human, and that's one of the things that sets us aside from machines.
And keeping humans in the loop. When John was working on the book, we would talk about what was his sort of lodestar. And his metric for seeing whether a designer was friend or foe was often, did humans stay in the loop in a system, on an automated system? And that's going to be true in our everyday jobs. How much is our role and how much are the intelligent machines?
And just briefly put, the heart of the book is that increasingly we can design systems that are basically without humans, or we can design systems around humans, and that's a human choice.
Yeah, and it's very, very difficult because people have argued fly-by-wire, automating air flight, diminishes pilots' capacity. And yet then we have a case in Germany where a pilot on purpose flies a plane into a mountain. So it's very, very complicated. Let's try to get as many as we can now.
So I keep thinking about this for the last couple of years, that we're moving into an age of utter abundance, and humans, I think we're probably at peak employment because we're going to have a lot of people out of work. Are we going to have to transition to a society sooner rather than later of a basic guaranteed income? What do people do with themselves when they basically have everything on a platter served by robots and there's really not an economy where people have to work? I start to think that maybe work is overrated. If I was in the 1% class at this point, I certainly wouldn't be busting my butt trying to build robots, right? But that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, in the 60s, there was a big question around the problem of leisure. It gets dismissed. Of course, our beloved George McGovern wants to have a national income in 1972. He is crushed at the polls. But this is coming back. This idea is coming back.
But first of all, I mean, I have trouble with this notion about peak employment because it turns out now that there are more people working in America at the moment than there ever have been in history. So now the issue is polarization. What's happened since the recession is the middle is dropping out. And I think that's part automation, because it turns out that routine white-collar work is being automated. But everywhere you look, the situation is more nuanced than it looked. For example, a bunch of the books that have come out recently warning about the kind of scenario you're talking about have cited the fact that 13 programmers at Instagram displaced 140,000 programmers at Kodak. And when you begin to pick that apart, that is in fact not what happened. What happened was that Kodak basically put a gun to its head and pulled the trigger numerous times, and at the end it was dead. It was not Instagram that killed Kodak, but the important point to make there is that before Instagram could happen, the internet had to happen. Instagram grew up on the mature internet, and the mature internet created about 2.5 million pretty good jobs around the world. So it's
this problem of jobs is difficult.
Issue. Yeah.
However, socialism for humans failed, but maybe socialism for robots won't fail. One of John's very good friends, Jerry Kaplan, who has a new book out on robots and work, has said we should ban corporations from owning non-factory robots. And we should only allow individuals to own robots. So maybe something like the Markoff Manifesto, maybe we can get behind that right here and now and say, socialism for robots.
Yeah.
Let's control them. Let's regulate them. Let's pass laws to ban robots from doing things we don't like. Let's go back to the old-fashioned way of running the world. What do you think of that, John?
I think let's take the next question.
Just to follow up on the last two, it seems like we might want to redefine what a job actually is, or at least start to put some form around that. I mean, is it something that's a necessity task for society? Is it how we keep ourselves busy? If robots are taking our jobs, is it really a job at that point? I mean, what's the purpose of work and job in our lives? And I guess that word is just so vague.
Yeah. So the one place I looked at this, there have been some wonderful experiments, actually in India, where they have basically given villages, they're not developed economies, but developing economies, where they've given a income floor in these villages. And you know, the conservative point of view is that when you do this, you create a lazy population. But in fact, in these experiments, that's not what happened. That people became more entrepreneurial, actually, when they had sort of the necessities of life taken care of. And to me, that's a very optimistic point of view. But on the other hand, it's not clear to me we're at that point yet. I think that if society does come to the point where vast increases of productivity put millions of people out of work, that's fair. But in fact, if you look at the last 5 years, and this is what throws this great acceleration of robot technology into question, productivity statistics in America have been flat over the last, if we're making this great progress, why is productivity not showing up? It's this Robert Solow stuff. Computers are everywhere, but in the productivity statistics, it's a very difficult problem.
Yeah. Can we get another one in? Let's do that. Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. John, you mentioned the movie Her, and I think most of us had a pretty visceral, guttural reaction to the relationships in Her. And I'm wondering, do you think we will develop sort of an international code of conduct, a Geneva Convention of sorts, for behaving around the things we create?
I think that we need to spend a decade actually interacting with these machines. I mean, the Her-like kinds of behavior are just starting to happen. And my perspective is, over the next half-decade, speech recognition is going to become extremely good. Apple is already claiming that they're at 5% accuracy levels. Humans recognize speech at about 4%. So if these machines can understand us, and if speech synthesis moves as quickly as it appears to, we're going to have interaction with machines that we cannot separate out from human interaction. And the social scientist and the science fiction writer in me goes, oh my God, this is going to change the world. Most of our interactions, more of our interactions will be with machines perhaps than with humans. What kind of a world will that be? I think we actually need the Geneva Accord for robot weapons, as opposed to robots who are supposed to be machines of loving grace and take care of us. And I heard that a lot of this conference is about games. And I have this sense that maybe we've in terms of the sort of the role that multiplayer interactive games have begun to play in society, we're already sort of partway down that path. People are living in fantasy worlds, and there will be these emergent sort of computer-supported worlds that will be populated by things that are AI, and that will be routine in the world. That wouldn't surprise me within a half a decade to a decade. And then, I hate to speculate on anything that's more than 5 years out, I guess.
But bravo to the question, because the UN has already set in motion a convention on autonomous weapons, robot weapons, and that could extend to labor. So that's a very good question. Let's take another.
There's somebody over there who's had, oops, I keep giving them, after, yeah.
So there are several research institutions working on the problem of friendly AI right now, and mathematical rules to ensure positive behavior toward humans. Given that there are so many companies and countries like China working on robotics and AI, what do you think we can do to ensure that those rules that they come up with are programmed in from the beginning before it's too late?
So there are Asimov's 3 laws of robotics and the 0th law that the robot also has to protect humanity. But whenever I hear that discussion, I'm faced with the reality is, what do you do if you design a moral robot and your enemy designs a robot that doesn't have the same morals? What happens? And to me, that seems like an imponderable and a problem for the notion of how do you sort of control this technology. I don't see an easy, let's assume you can put code that's moral into these machines, but how can you make sure that the humans on either side of the equation do that? I don't know how to solve that problem.
Great question, very difficult one. Let's have a final question, maybe.
This gentleman here.
Okay.
So when we were watching the video with the 4-legged robots, it reminded me of like a man and his dog. So my question is, do you believe maybe in the future that we could have some sort of symbiotic relationship similar to a man or a person and their pet?
Yeah, I was trying to get at that earlier. That, we have such a predisposition to anthropomorphizing anything that vaguely appears human that I think it's almost certain to happen. That company, Boston Dynamics, which used to do things for the Pentagon, and the robots you saw were originally designed to carry loads on the battlefield. Andy Rubin went around the country and the world and bought up most of the best roboticists for Google. And Google hasn't said anything about what they intend to do with that technology. Andy left the company about a year after he started this project. But when he was going around and sort of pushing his vision to the companies that he bought, the idea was Google's going to compete with Amazon. And he had this idea of the Google car showing up in front of your door and the Google robot hopping off the back and running the package up to your door. It makes a lot of sense in a logical sense. I actually think it's probably 2 decades at least away, and anything more than 5 years away I think of as entire speculation, but that was the direction he was going in.
Just in parting, this has really been great. We've really been glad to be here. In just terms of jobs, most of our jobs are delivery service. The postal service is still the 5th largest employer in the United States. So a lot of job loss to come in the short run. So we're going to be talking about this for a long time. Just wish John Markoff, thank you so much for coming, John. It's really been terrific. Thank you so much, John.